If tonight you've come for a villain, you won't find one here. But if you've come for a ruler, a mysterious king set apart even from the gods, you're in the right place. Together, we'll see how Hades' earlier struggles shaped his dominion, how his love story with Persephone changed the seasons, and how his underworld became both a prison and a place of peace. This isn't just mythology, it's a mirror of how humans understood life, loss, and memory. Did you know Hades' very first breath wasn't taken in the open sky, but in a place that wasn't even meant to cradle life? His earliest memory would not have been light or sound, but the silent press of his father's belly. That was the strange beginning of one of the most enduring figures in all of Greek mythology. Hades was born to Cronus and Rhea, part of a family where love and fear collided from the start. Cronus wasn't just any father, he was a titan who had risen against the heavens and claimed his throne by force. Yet even with his great strength and his control over the world, he lived in terror of a single possibility, that his own child might one day rise against him, just as he had once risen against his own father. That fear shaped everything, and it twisted the idea of parenthood into something darker. Imagine carrying a child into the world, only for the birth to be treated not with joy, but with a sentence. Every time Rhea brought a new child into existence, Cronus acted on that fear. He didn't simply lock them away, he swallowed them whole. Hestia, Hera, Demeter, and Poseidon, all consumed before their lives could even begin. No cries, no growing bodies, no futures, just swallowed like morsels, swallowed out of dread of a prophecy. And then came Hades next in line, an infant taken from his mother's arms before he could see the world. Think about that for a moment. For most of us, our first breath comes with space to grow, with light above us and air around us. For Hades, it was the opposite. His first sense of being was sealed in his father's gut. Darkness thicker than any night sky, no sound except the dull churn of imprisonment, no contact except with the siblings trapped beside him. It was not a tomb, but it was close. That image, the swallowing, wasn't only disturbing because of the physical act. It meant something larger too. Cronus swallowed possibility. He ate futures. He folded his children not out of sight, but out of being, trying to prevent time itself from moving forward. In a way, it was the ultimate act of control, as though, if he could hold the heirs within himself forever, the prophecy would remain folded in silence, and the wheel of destiny would stop turning. But time never stops, not even for titans. Inside that living prison, Hades grew in quiet. No sun, no stars, no voices but the rhythm of his father's body. He was alive, yet his life was confined to stillness and waiting. It's hard to picture, because for us darkness often has an end. The lights come on, the sun rises, the door opens. For Hades, nothing promised an ending. Days could not be measured, because there were no days. There was only the continuous, unbroken press of silence. This kind of beginning matters, because when someone begins life already half swallowed by oblivion, their identity takes on a different shade. Hades would not be a child of brightness or laughter. He would be a child marked by endurance. A child already closer to the world of death than to the living earth above. Survival became his first act, and that shaped the rest of his being. You can almost see how it set the stage for his eventual role. If Zeus, born free and hidden away in safety, was destined to rule the sky, then Hades, who first knew the world as shadow and stillness, would later find his domain in darkness as well. It wasn't punishment, it was alignment. A life born in confinement naturally leaned toward what humans call death, but which in mythology was simply another state of existence. Still, the mystery of his survival lingers. How can someone rise to power when their life starts in such complete silence? It's nearly impossible to imagine that from that still cocoon, a future king could one day emerge. And yet, mythology shows us that Even buried beginnings can hold the seeds of strength. What seemed to Cronus like a final act of control was only a delay. We might think of it like a seed buried deep in the soil, covered, unseen, pressed into silence. To the eye, it looks like the end of the story. But under that weight, the seed does not die. It waits. Every swallowed child was a seed, hidden but not destroyed. Hades was one of those seeds. His survival folded beneath Cronus's fear. It's strange to consider how close his story is tied to death, even before he ruled over it. Born into an imitation of the grave, his earliest identity rested on patience, on the ability to exist even when stripped of light and promise. That bond with silence shaped his path. Not in flashes of thunder or breaking waves, but in the endurance of shadow. And yet just beyond that silence, something was waiting. There was one child Cronus failed to devour, one infant who slipped past his jaw and into safety, cradled in secret. While Hades lay still in his father's belly, his youngest brother hidden beneath the sky was breathing free air and growing strong. That single act of trickery by their mother Rhea became the thread that would unravel Cronus's grip. For now, though, Hades remained inside, unknowingly bound to a prophecy larger than himself. His first gift was survival. His first lesson was that darkness can hold on, but it cannot keep everything forever. Stay with me, because the one who escaped with only a clever trick will become the key that sets Hades and his siblings loose, changing not just their fates, but the fates of the cosmos itself. Imagine defeating a monster with nothing but a stone wrapped in cloth. That's how the downfall of a titan began, through a trick so simple it sounds almost too strange to believe. Cronus, the great titan who swallowed his children rather than risk being dethroned by them, was not undone by a war or even by a weapon, but by one desperate plan designed by his wife, Rhea. She was the one who grew tired of losing every child to his jaws and dared to twist the story. By the time Rhea carried her youngest, she had already seen her older children taken away moments after birth. Each time she brought life into the world, Cronus consumed it in fear. He believed swallowing his heirs would secure his throne forever. To him, each child was not a person, but a prophecy, a living threat waiting to grow. But this time was different. This time, Rhea decided to stop the cycle. So the plan was born. A rock, nothing more than a lump of earth, swaddled in cloth the way an infant might be. She offered it to Cronus, as if it were her newborn son. Driven by paranoia, he didn't question it. He didn't unwrap it, didn't notice the cold weight in the bundle. His fear of prophecy had hardened into routine. He simply opened his mouth and swallowed the stone whole, thinking he had once again outwitted fate. In that instant, he sealed his own defeat without realizing it. The real child, Zeus, was spirited away, hidden in secret while his siblings remained buried in Cronus's belly. Imagine the contrast. While Hades pressed in silence, his soul caught in the endless hush of his father's body, his youngest brother breathed air. Zeus grew under open sky, able to sense wind and light. Every breath he took marked a radical difference from what his older brothers and sisters endured. It's striking. Two brothers split by fate, one living outside with the chance to grow strong, the other still trapped with no sense of time. I want you to picture this difference. Hades' life was like being locked in a closed room where nothing changes. No cycles of day or night, no markers of growth, just being held and prevented from becoming. Zeus, on the other hand, was like a child in a field, free to stretch, to learn, to live in rhythm. That divide created two completely different kinds of being. One learned patience in stillness, the other strength in freedom. Rhea's stone was more than a decoy. It was a moment where the universe tilted. Without it, there would have been no saviour for the siblings inside Cronus. the rock bought time, and in a myth where time itself was personified by their father, buying time was the most powerful act of all. Think about the irony. Cronus, who swallowed children to stop destiny, swallowed a stone instead, an object without life, without threat. His own battle against prophecy turned into a self-made trap. What makes this story so fascinating isn't only the trick itself, but what it says about power. Cronus imagined control meant consumption, that holding his children inside him froze all outcomes. But the trick shows the limit of that thinking. You can consume, but you can't stop growth if even one seed escapes. It's like trying to stop a forest from spreading by cutting down every sapling, but forgetting a single seed blown to another patch of soil. Just one can grow into an entire future. And that seed, that source of change, was Zeus, hidden away, raised in secrecy, spared from the fate of his siblings. For Hades, still trapped within Cronus, this meant something he could not even sense yet. Hope. Silent as he was, pressed into the belly of fear, there was a lifeline moving outside, preparing to one day come back for him. From his perspective inside, nothing gave a hint of salvation. But outside, destiny was already in motion. Do you notice how perfectly the myth balances patience with action? Hades had no choice but to endure confinement. Zeus, on the other hand, was growing into action. Their roles depended on each other. Without Zeus, Hades would never have escaped. Without Hades, Zeus would never have allies strong enough to overthrow Cronus. The stillness of one and the freedom of the other were not opposites, but two halves of a single plan written by myth. Cronus, meanwhile, continued on, unaware of how brittle his control had become. He thought he still held every heir inside him. He thought the prophecy was locked away in silence, but with each passing day, Zeus gained strength. The Titan had lost track of the smallest detail, that sometimes the thing you ignore becomes your undoing. His defeat began not with a weapon, but with a refusal, Rhea refusing to hand over her last child. Now imagine for a moment what it must have felt like for Rhea herself, a mother watching one after another of her children vanish into her husband's gut, powerless to stop it. Until finally, she found a way to trick him. It must have taken cunning and courage to risk such a plan. After all, if Cronus suspected her, both she and the child would have been doomed. Instead, she managed to turn her husband's paranoia against him. It wasn't strength, it wasn't violence, it was sheer strategy. A rock, nothing more, changed the course of gods. So here we are, a world where Hades waits in silence, Persephone not yet by his side, his future still trapped within Cronus. Poseidon, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia lie folded beside him, all unborn in the practical sense, and outside, Zeus moves in secret, nurtured, sheltered, breathing, growing. The split between confinement and freedom marks this turning point. The stone trick is the hinge on which their fates swing. While Cronus feasted on his fake assurance, the true heir was preparing for his return. And that return would not only free Hades, but alter every corner of existence the Titans thought they had secured. Because in myth, it isn't just weapons or power that decide victory. Sometimes it's the quiet trick, the moment of imagination that changes destiny. So when you think back on Hades in that endless hush, waiting like a seed in soil, remember that freedom was already stirring in the world above him. His path toward the underworld, his role as ruler of the dead, all of it depended on this single act of deception. The swallowed stone was no ordinary object. It was the beginning of change itself. Zeus, hidden outside, would carry that change within him until he was ready to confront his father. And when that day came, the silent endurance of Hades and the overlooked trick of the stone would merge into a story of release. But before we jump to that moment of release, remember, Hades had no knowledge of this yet. He was still inside, still waiting, and the question remained. How could a brother he had never even seen set him free from a prison so complete? That is where the tale now leads, toward the moment when swallowed gods finally rise back into the world. So here's the thing, gods do not stay swallowed forever. That's the strange truth hidden inside this story. Cronus thought he had ended the prophecy by consuming every child born to him, folding them into his own stomach like secrets locked in a vault. But fate has a way of opening locked doors, and in mythology, even a titan's belly wasn't made to hold divinity forever. By the time Zeus grew into adulthood, the illusion of safety that Cronus clung to had already begun to crack. Imagine the youngest son standing outside the prison that had silenced his family. Unlike his siblings, Zeus grew with air in his lungs, water on his lips, and the rhythm of mountains and storms around him. From the very beginning, he carried with him what his brothers and sisters never had: freedom from confinement. That freedom shaped him into the one sibling capable of fighting back. Still, Cronus seemed untouchable. He had swallowed gods, his own children, living immortals sealed within himself. To any mortal mind, this would be unthinkable. Even to other gods, the idea of breaking such a hold felt impossible. Cronus was time itself in a way, devouring everything that threatened him, absorbing it until nothing seemed to remain. Against that power, what could a single son do? This is where another figure joined the tale. Metis. She was known for cleverness, the kind of mind that sees not through force but through strategy. Zeus turned to her, not with fists or weapons, but with a plan shaped by wisdom. Metis offered him a tool not made of bronze or fire, but of craft, an elixir brewed to twist the inside of Cronus's body against him. Not poison meant to kill, but a potion designed to force release. Think about how remarkable that is. Cronus had devoured gods themselves, assuming that once inside his body, they would remain frozen forever. He thought his children's lives were reduced to silence, but Metis's brew reminded him that even titans had limits, that his gut was not an eternal dungeon. When Cronus drank the potion, the effect was immediate. For once his power turned against him. He convulsed, his body twisting, as if struck by something he had never expected. One by one, the swallowed gods began to rise. Think of the image, a titan, once certain of control, forced to give back everything he had taken. His body pulled open by the prophecy he fought to deny. First came Hestia, then Demeter, then Hera, Poseidon, and finally Hades, all of them emerging intact, reborn into the world they should never have been denied. It's vivid because what they experienced wasn't just being released, it was a kind of second birth. They had already been born once from their mother Rhea, only to be swallowed and erased. Now they were forced out again, not from a womb, but from a prison of fear. Imagine being held in silence for what felt like endless time, then suddenly rushing out into air again. Light, sound, space. Everything your senses had been denied returned at once. Birth and resurrection combined. For Hades especially, this was more than release. He had endured that darkness the longest, trapped not for hours or days, but for an unmeasured eternity, with nothing to mark change, no moment to anchor memory. To emerge at last was to discover himself again. He stepped out, not as an infant this time, but as a god with purpose. He carried the mark of confinement with him, not visible on his form, but written into his identity. Having lived inside a living grave, he would forever hold a bond with endurance, patience, and death itself. The shift was immediate. What had been silent prisoners, forgotten inside their father's belly, had now become warriors. Each child that emerged stood not as a victim, but as an heir who had survived against the odds. The prophecy Cronus feared had turned into his undoing in front of him. He tried to stop his children by swallowing them, and in the end gave them birth twice over. That second release gave them not just life, but a reason to fight. If you pause to think about it, the whole reversal of power is striking. Cronus imagined himself invincible, keeping everything locked inside. But in that moment of vomiting them out, his body betrayed him. The Titan who devoured immortals was reduced, forced into weakness, and the children who were swallowed became armed with proof that survival was already on their side. You can't erase what is divine. You can only delay it. Hades' emergence wasn't just symbolic, it was the start of his role in the coming rebellion. He would not roar with thunder like Zeus nor shake the seas like Poseidon. But what came out of Cronus' belly wasn't only a brother among many. Hades was survival, itself turned into a weapon. Inside the belly of time he had endured silence so complete that most would imagine it unbearable. That endurance transformed him when he stepped back into the world. He knew what it meant to live pressed against oblivion, and that gave him an edge no Titan could match. It's helpful here to think of a candle. If you place it under glass, sealed away, its flame will sputter and starve. But if the wick itself is unburnt and you raise the glass, the flame comes back stronger, fed by the air it had been denied. Hades was like that wick, sheltered but suffocated, until Zeus lifted the glass. The spark that returned carried with it not just light, but resilience. From that moment, everything shifted for the siblings. They were no longer scattered between silence and secrecy. Zeus had acted, the potion had worked, and the forgotten heirs were now united in freedom. For the first time, they could look at each other as more than swallowed shadows. They stood as a family, scarred by what happened, but ready to turn confinement into strength. Cronus, on the other hand, had no path back. Once you regurgitate prophecy, you can't swallow it again. The fates he tried to control were standing right before him, stronger for surviving both birth and burial. The war to come would decide who ruled the cosmos, but its foundation was laid in that single act, the disgorging of swallowed gods. And so Hades, once voiceless, in the belly of fear, now stood side by side with his siblings. He carried the memory of silence into the open, a scar no one could see, but one that gave him weight in what was about to unfold. From there, he could finally grow, not trapped, not waiting, but acting. He was no longer only the child who had endured more than any other. He was now a freed god, about to use the endurance learned in shadow as his strength in war. That's the paradox of this moment. What Cronus thought marked control instead created rebellion. What he thought ended the prophecy instead brought it into being. And for Hades, escaping the belly of time wasn't just about survival. It was the first step toward the role he would carry forever. From prisoner, he became a warrior. From silence, a ruler. And his mark of survival would follow him straight into the most legendary war the gods had ever faced. What if the most powerful weapons in mythology were not forged on mountains or in heavens above, but in the deepest shadows of the earth? That's where the most decisive tools of the Olympians' war came to life. Strange allies, fierce and almost unthinkable, crawled back into the story when Zeus and his reborn siblings decided they could not face Cronus and the Titans without help. Those allies were the Cyclopes and the Hundred-Handers, beings of immense strength and skill, who until then had lain buried, locked in Tartarus beneath the roots of the world. Freed from their dungeon, these ancient beings shifted the balance of power. They had been imprisoned by Cronus himself, left to stagnate in the choking blackness of Tartarus. When Zeus released them, their gratitude aligned with the purpose of the young gods, and with that freedom came gifts that would shape the future battlefield. The Cyclopes, known not just for their immense bodies but for their unmatched skill in shaping raw elements, became the smiths of divine warfare. The war between Titans and Olympians wasn't only a clash of brute force, it was also a contest of strategy, tools, and unseen edges. The Titans had age, power, and the high ground of experience. They were older than the gods who opposed them, woven into the bones of the earth itself. Without something to disrupt that balance, the Olympians had little chance of victory. This is where the Cyclops' craft mattered more than any thunder or earthquake the young gods could summon by themselves. Out of fire and darkness, the Cyclopes forged weapons so potent they shaped not only the outcome of the battle, but the character of each brother in ways we still remember. To Zeus they gave the thunderbolt, brilliant and sudden, the perfect tool for a leader who needed power that inspired awe and fear in equal measure. The lightning strike could pierce the battlefield faster than the eye could follow, turning the will of the sky into Zeus's personal command. Poseidon's gift was the trident, three-pronged, sharp, and resonant with his link to the sea. With it, he could rupture the world, split earth from ocean, shake foundations themselves. The seas became both weapon and throne. If Zeus ruled the air and storm, Poseidon's trident gave him dominion over the waters that circled every land and shaped every coast. And then there was Hades. To him the Cyclops gave something unlike thunder or tide. His weapon was the helm of darkness. To call it armour would miss the point. It was a force, a covering that stripped away any trace of presence. When worn, Hades was not merely hidden, he was erased. The helm made him invisible, undetectable by eye or sense. To his enemies it seemed as though the shadows themselves had opened and allowed an intruder to step through unseen. This invisibility carried suspense far beyond the battlefield. It wasn't only the idea of attack without warning, it was the fear of what couldn't be grasped, what couldn't be seen. The helm embodied what Hades himself would later rule: silence, invisibility, the unknown realm of the dead. While thunderbolts lit the sky and tridents churned the seas, Hades struck where sight and sound could not follow. Here's why this mattered so deeply. In open combat, the Titans had the edge. They had size, endurance, and their roots in the very stone of creation. They could wear down opponents with sheer force. But when Hades put on the helm, all of that strength meant little. Imagine an army of giants bracing themselves for blows, only to be undone by strikes they never saw. Confusion spread in them as their lines broke from panic. The helm turned Hades into the embodiment of strategy through absence. Where Zeus displayed blazing power and Poseidon roared with water's might, Hades whispered through silence. If you think of war like two wrestlers locked in struggle, Hades was not the one pushing hardest. He was the hand that slipped behind, pulling balance away. Invisibility undermined confidence, it stole orientation, and it left the Titans unable to predict where the next attack would come. Think of it like a game of sight and sound. Imagine if, in the middle of a crowded space, one figure disappears entirely, yet still moves among you. No footsteps, no shadow, no outline. That's what Hades became in combat, a ghost before the underworld would ever have been his kingdom. The simple lack of visibility bred dread in even the most ancient Titan. Fear did not need thunder to shake them, it needed the absence of anchor. The truth is, Hades' helm is more unsettling than thunderbolts or ocean storms. Humans fear noise for a time, but they adapt to it. The mind adjusts to crashes of thunder or crashing waves. But emptiness, someone gone from sight while still present, that lingers in the imagination long after the moment passes. The helm used uncertainty itself as a weapon, and so Hades carved his place in the war, not by matching Titan strength with strength, but by unravelling their certainty piece by piece. It's worth noticing how these gifts mapped the brothers to their realms even before the cosmos was divided. Zeus with the thunderbolt already sounded like a king of the sky. Poseidon with the trident carried the sea in his hand, and Hades with the helm of darkness held invisibility itself, the shadow of death. The war had not yet ended, but their emblems already hinted at the roles to come. If you think about the order of it all, it's almost as though the cosmos was arranging itself through tools. The Cyclopes didn't just arm brothers, they set identity into motion. The war to follow would test every skill, but without these weapons, the Olympians might never have broken through the Titans' colossal line. Hades' contribution, often less remembered, may have been the most critical. His invisibility was not flashy. It didn't light skies or tear oceans, but it destabilized. The Titans could not fight what they could not see, and without that unseen hand breaking order from within, the Olympians would have remained outmatched. So, as the next battle loomed, each brother carried a symbol of his role: sky, sea, and shadow. Zeus ready with thunder's crack, Poseidon with waves at his call, and Hades all but erased from sight, prepared to enter the war as absence itself given form. Together, those secret weapons shaped the fate of gods and titans alike, and Hades with his helm became essential to the war's possibility of victory. And if you pause for a moment, you can sense why myths might have chosen such a gift for him specifically. Darkness does not need to shout. It waits, it shifts, and it consumes. The helm of darkness was not only a weapon, it was a reflection of the one who had lived in silence longer than any of his kin, and who would one day rule an unseen world with the same quiet certainty that once turned a battlefield in his favour. Did you know the war between the Olympian gods and the Titans stretched on for 10 full years? A decade, not of human time, but of clashes the myths described as shaking the foundations of earth and sky. Imagine a conflict so drawn out that it became less a battle and more a test of endurance, a slow grind where neither side could fully overwhelm the other. The Greeks gave this struggle a name, the Titanomachy, and it marked the shift from an older order of rulers to the gods we still hear about today. When you picture the scale, don't think of battlefields with neatly lined ranks or single-day conflicts. Think instead of storms that roll in season after season, crashing and breaking, with no end in sight. The Titans, older and immense, carried the raw weight of age and experience. They were the very children of the primal gods who shaped the world itself. Against them stood the Olympians, younger, less tested, but driven by fresh weapons, cunning, and not least the hunger for freedom after release from Cronus's belly. From the start, the advantage tilted toward the Titans. They knew how to wield the very forces of nature. Their bodies, their presence, embodied the weight of rock, river, and storm. It was like facing mountains that walked and thunder that carried intelligence. The Olympians were not weak, but they were new to this scale of battle. To fight sheer strength, they needed something else: patience, strategy, and unity. It's here that we see a sharp contrast. The Titans often fought using raw might, relying on their overwhelming power and their long memory of ruling from the very beginning of the cosmos. The Olympians fought differently. Their war did not rely on one god at a time, but on the coordination of siblings. They had weapons gifted by the Cyclopes. They had the enormous arms of the 100-handers. But more than that, they had focus, and this focus came from Zeus, aligning each piece into a strategy that could answer the brute power of their enemies. The decade passed in waves of stalemate and reprieve. Neither side gained the upper edge for long, and yet, hidden within this back and forth, Hades took on a role no less vital than Zeus's thunder or Poseidon's trident. You might think invisibility is a trick, a side power compared to a storm or an earthquake. But on this battlefield, it was the invisible that crumbled the Titans from within. When Hades wore his helm, he left no shadow and made no sound. He became absence itself. In battle, that meant the Titans never knew where he stood. Their eyes sought him out, finding only empty space where a foe should be, while their attention aimed at Poseidon's waves or Zeus's lightning bolts. Unseen strikes disrupted their lines. A spear knocked from a hand, a blow aimed from behind, confusion spread like a ripple across their defences. It wasn't sheer force, it was the quiet turn of balance without warning. Think of it like trying to stand steady in a dark room where something keeps brushing against your arm, but you can't see it. The fear gnaws at your focus until your stance collapses. That was Hades' gift in battle, not the loud gesture of a single blow, but the silence that broke confidence. Once confidence slipped, strength followed close behind. The Olympians took advantage of this. They learned to coordinate in ways the Titans, with their pride and individual force, often did not. Zeus would draw attention with flashing thunderbolts, searing light across the fighting ground. Poseidon would roar with his trident, tearing up footholds and smashing waves into Titan bodies. And while all eyes faced that spectacle, Hades vanished into their blind spots and struck where they were weakest. This partnership slowly began to shape the decade of struggle. At first, nothing seemed to change. Hades slipped in and struck, but the Titans still rallied, still pushed back with vigour. Yet repeated tests add up. War is as much about wearing down stamina as claiming momentary victories. The Titans carried the burden of age, and the Olympians, young and newly armed, endured. Each time Hades disrupted their footing, each surge of confusion built into a larger weakness. So here's the twist: the gods' survival didn't just rest on raw power. It depended on undermining the certainty of their enemies, bit by bit. By the 7th and 8th years, the cracks in Titan defences were visible. Younger gods, who once fought cautiously, now pressed forward with confidence. The 100-handers hurled great rocks, the Cyclops' gifts shone brilliantly, and through it all, Hades kept the ground unstable for his opponents. You can see how long this drawn conflict was if you think about it like building erosion. A single storm won't wear down a cliffside, but storm after storm, year after year, carves new lines, deep cuts, and eventually topples stone. That was the Titanomachy, 10 years of constant weathering, repeated blows, both seen and unseen. What strikes me most about Hades in this moment is how his role echoes his very nature. He didn't shine with the obvious force of sky or sea. He didn't roar with command. His work was shadowy, subtle, and constant, like death itself. Death is not always about a sudden end. It works like erosion, quiet, patient, inevitable. And on the battlefield against the Titans, Hades carried that inevitability into action. The climax of the war, of course, came after those 10 years of equal struggle. But before that final push, everything hinged on the pressure created by strategy. Without Hades' unseen hand removing balance, the Titans would have stood unshaken, braced solid against every thunderbolt and every wave. Noise can stun, but certainty can steady you again. What invisibility did was strip away that certainty, leaving the strongest beings in creation unsure, unsettled, and open to defeat. So when the war shifted toward victory for the Olympians, it was not only thunder and seas that pushed them forward, it was also shadow, an unseen god moving through the lines, striking without trace. Without those silent disruptions, the Titans might have stood firm until even Zeus's storms died out. The Olympians might never have broken through their defences, but they did break through, and once the decade ended, the struggle of age against youth resolved into a turning point that would reshape the cosmos itself. Out of thunder, ocean, and shadow, victory was forged, and in that quiet shadow, Hades had already proven himself as more than survivor. He was the unseen hand that made triumph possible. So how did Hades end up in the underworld instead of the wide sky or the rolling sea? After the thunder faded and the decade-long war of gods against titans reached its final blow, the victors stood at a crossroads. They had fought for freedom, they had held together through years of chaos, but now the question was larger than battle. Who would rule what parts of existence? The cosmos itself still lay vast and unshaped in terms of governance. The sky, the sea, the earth, and the unseen depths waited for order. That decision carried consequences not just for them as brothers, but for all who lived within the Greek imagination of the world. Picture this moment. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, three figures cut by war and sharpened by endurance, stood together. They had taken down Cronus and undone the power of the Titans, but their victory gave them no single throne. Instead, it left them with a world that needed dividing. Think of it like inheriting a massive estate with no single key. The halls and rooms stretched on forever. The foundations reached into layers unknown, and each sibling had to claim their share. But unlike land and stone, what they were dividing was eternal. Sky, sea, and shadowless depth. The tension must have been profound. Zeus was the youngest, but his thunderbolt and leadership had guided them to victory. Poseidon bore the trident, still humming with power from the churning sea. Hades carried his helm, a shadow that unsettled even titans. They were equals in struggle, bound by shared survival. Yet the cosmos had no neat plan to decide who should reign where. If resentment grew among them, then everything they had fought for could collapse into another war, this time among brothers. Instead of battle, they chose ritual, and it was a ritual rooted in chance. They would draw lots, no persuasion, no duel, no judgment of seniority. The universe would be assigned by what came to hand. But imagine that for a moment. A game of chance, almost casual in its form, used to decide dominion over sky, sea, and death. It shows something striking about myth. Even gods, after war, trusted fate to finalize their order. Think about it as a kind of lottery. Not with coins or cards, but with tokens that carried ultimate consequence. Roll them out, reach inside the container, and pull what destiny has prepared for you. Not by cunning, not by strength, but by randomness, or perhaps by inevitability, working through what looks like chance. Because in Greek myth, what seems like fortune often hides the deeper movement of fate. That steady current no god or mortal could undo. Zeus drew the vault of the heavens, the skies themselves, open and endless, filled with clouds, storms, and light, became his rightful domain. Poseidon took the seas, with their rolling expanse, their tempest power, their reach to every coast. And Hades drew the underworld, the space beneath, unseen but vast, as deep as the sky was high. Now here's the essential part. Hades did not receive the underworld as punishment. The myths do not frame it as being cast down or excluded. It was not exile. It was a portion, a share given by the same ritual as the rest. If anything, it was fairer than any negotiation might have been, because chance allowed each brother to accept the result without quarrel. In this form, Hades' domain became not a mark of rejection, but of rightful sovereignty. To us, the underworld might sound like a grim reward. Chasms, shades, rivers flowing black or fiery, but in myth, it was every bit as necessary as the sky and sea. Without someone to govern death, the cycle of life could not be complete. Without order beneath the surface, chaos would have bled into every corner of existence. Hades' realm gave the Greeks a structure, a place to imagine the journey after life, a map for what happens beyond the final breath. Seen this way, the drawing of lots was more than a division of spoils. It was the shaping of balance. The sky could stretch above forever, but without the counterweight of the underworld, it lacked depth. The sea might churn endlessly, but without boundaries pressed from below, its reach would have no form. Every domain reflected another, and together they created a total sphere of existence, balanced between the three brothers. For Hades himself, it may have felt less like victory than like alignment. He had lived in darkness once before, inside Cronus, enduring silence and confinement. He had wielded a helm that blurred him from sight, a weapon of absence. What better ruler for the underworld than the one already bonded to shadow and endurance? His life had been marked by silence from the start. Drawing the underworld didn't lock him into something unnatural. It confirmed what was already present in his story. The ritual of lots also eased tension among gods. Imagine if Zeus had simply claimed the sky, Poseidon the sea, and left Hades to argue his fate. Resentment might spark, brothers could turn against one another, but placing the decision in the hands of chance or in the hands of fate working through chance meant none of them could quarrel with the outcome. Each received a share, neither more valid nor more cursed than the next. Of course, humans later often saw Hades differently. They looked to the underworld with more fear than awe, forgetting that his rule was equal in dignity to his brothers. But the myth itself, at this moment, paints him not as fallen or lesser, but as divided fairly. His role was needed. His kingship was legitimate. Kingship of the dead was still kingship over a vast realm, one that touched every mortal life without fail. If you fold this back into the larger story, it shows how the Greek imagination treated balance. Victory wasn't the end. Power wasn't simply claimed by might. Instead, fate tied the rulership of cosmos to chance, and in doing so, reminded us that even the strongest must accept limits. For Hades, that meant claiming the unseen depths as his rightful throne. So when you think of him, don't picture banishment or loss. Picture a fair share, chosen by the same hand that gave Zeus his skies and Poseidon his seas. Hades became the ruler of the underworld, not as exile, not as villain, but as king by the same chance that bound the world into three parts: air above, water around, and shadow below. And from that world divided, new structures would form. Each brother built his dominion, each aligned to his weapon, his nature, his path. The cosmos no longer drifted in chaos. It settled into layers, open heavens, restless seas, and silent underworld, each waiting for stories that still carry their weight into the night. Imagine rivers you can't drink from, and fields where the voices of the past linger forever. This was the world entrusted to Hades, a kingdom of shadows that the Greeks described with a map as detailed as any you'd find above ground. The underworld wasn't a shapeless void. It had rivers and regions, places for punishment, fields for wandering, and realms of peace. It was as structured as life itself, a mirror where every soul found its place. So here's the thing. When people think of Hades' domain, they often picture a single, vague darkness. But in the myths, his realm stretches like an enormous landscape. It isn't chaos, it's organised. It functions almost like a city, with borders, routes and districts. That order carried meaning. The Greeks used geography to explain experiences that we still grapple with: grief, forgetfulness, guilt, and even joy. At the heart of this imaginary terrain are rivers. Unlike rivers on Earth, nobody swam in these, and you didn't stop by for a drink. Each current embodied a different aspect of death and memory. The first and most famous is the river Styx. This river was not just water, but oath itself. Even the gods swore unbreakable promises on its waters. Cross it, and you weren't just moving into the underworld, you were leaving the ordinary world behind. The ferryman Charon guided souls across in his boat, provided they carried the proper coin. Without that, a soul lingered on the shore, caught in the space between living and dead. Then came Lethe. Think of it as the river of forgetfulness. A soul that drank from it would lose memory, shedding the weight of life above. Forgetting was not framed as cruelty. It was release, escape from the burdens carried for a lifetime. Without Lethe, memory itself might anchor the spirits too heavily. In myth, the act of forgetting was a part of rest, a way of making death less sharp. Another river was Cocytus, which means the river of lamentation. This stream wasn't calm. Its currents carried wails. Souls who floated here were those unburied, those still restless, holding sorrow like a weight. The Greeks imagined Cocytus as a soundscape more than a waterway. It was grief flowing through liquid, mourning turned into a river you could cross. There was also the Acheron, often called the River of Pain. Many accounts describe it as the border you must cross to reach Hades' kingdom in the first place. Acheron wasn't punishment itself, but the journey into suffering, the threshold that separated living breath from shadow. Its waters reflected the difficulty of transition, the ache of leaving behind the warmth of life. The last of the five is Phlegethon, the river of fire. Picture flames rolling like liquid, burning but never consumed. Unlike the coolness of Styx or the still tones of Lethe, this was fierce, a current that hinted of punishment and purification. Souls that burned weren't destroyed, they endured. The fire made Phlegethon a reminder of a boundary final and absolute. Together, the five streams framed Hades' realm, each one a different layer of the human condition, transformed into geography. But the underworld was not just rivers. Once inside, souls arrived at fields that split according to how they lived. These weren't random. They created a moral order for existence. At the depths was Tartarus, not a place for ordinary souls, but for those who had committed acts too heavy to forgive. Tartarus was a pit, grim and endless, where torment reflected deeds done above. Titans who fought against Zeus himself were cast here. Tartarus embodied punishment, not for everyone, but for the few who had to bear an eternity of consequence. By contrast, there was the field of Asphodel. This was the resting place for the ordinary majority, people who had lived neither heroically nor wickedly. Asphodel was quiet, neutral. Souls wandered there like shadows of their former selves. They did not suffer, but they did not rejoice either. It was grey in spirit, like a long dream without sharp edges. For many Greeks, this was the expected fate, not extreme reward, not unthinkable punishment, but an eternal twilight of existence. Above this lay Elysium, the fields of bliss. Imagine meadows touched by wind that never chilled, light that never burned, peace without weight. Elysium was the destination for heroes, for those chosen by the gods, or those granted the rare gift of a blessed fate. Here, souls found joy, rest, and harmony. Later stories even imagined cycles where souls moved between ordinary life, Lethe's forgetting waters, and new chances to reach Elysium again. It wasn't frozen into one path. There was motion, a possibility of endless renewal. The balance among Tartarus, Asphodel, and Elysium formed a complete map. Punishment for the darkest deeds, neutral wandering for the many, bliss for the rare few. For the Greeks, this was justice more than sentence. It wasn't arbitrary. Every soul had a place to settle, as natural as earth receiving seeds. or waves returning to shore. What makes this design fascinating is how it mirrors memory. Styx, oath and transition. Lethe, forgetting. Cocytus, mourning. Acheron, pain of leaving. Phlegethon, burn in permanence. Each river embodied an aspect of how humans process loss. And in the same way, the three fields reflected the spectrum of how we see lives remembered, condemned, forgotten, or honoured. It's almost like the underworld was a psychological map before the word psychology existed. The Greeks externalised inner states into rivers and regions. When mourning someone, you felt Cocytus. When letting go of the weight of grief, you drank from Lethe. When honouring a hero, you placed them in Elysium. In this way, Hades' domain wasn't abstract. It was a way to make sense of human experiences that otherwise had no image. If you think about it, the structure also offered comfort. Death wasn't simply a void. It had order, it had place, it had meaning. To say your loved one crossed the Acheron or came to wander Asphodel was less terrifying than imagining them vanish completely. The geography gave story to loss, and story gives shape to what we fear. That's why this part of Hades' realm has always been powerful. It doesn't just frighten, it explains. It shows death as movement through meaningful space, not collapse into nothing. For the Greeks, that space reflected balance, punishment, neutrality, joy. Each soul found footing in the geography of shadows. So the underworld, far from being random, tied itself to memory like a woven fabric. Forgetting and remembering, pain and release, sorrow and bliss. Each had its river, each had its field. Walk this imagined territory, and you find yourself walking through the spectrum of human experience. That is what made Hades' kingdom complete. Not only death itself, but an ordered mirror of how we live, how we mourn, and how we remember. What does abduction have to do with flowers blooming? The question sounds strange, almost contradictory, but at the heart of the myth of Hades and Persephone, that's exactly the connection. An event of taking becomes the explanation for the changing seasons, the pulse of blooming and withering that the Greeks saw repeated every year. The story begins, not in shadow, but in light. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest. She walked meadows and fields, a figure of growth. Her presence was life. When she touched the soil, the green answered. When she laughed, flowers rose. She was not only Demeter's child, but her companion, the constant focus of her mother's love. That closeness mattered, because what came next would disrupt more than a child being taken. It shook the world itself. Hades, ruler of the underworld, saw Persephone and desired her as his queen. Myths differ about how much he asked or how suddenly he acted, but one detail remained almost universal. He drew Persephone down through the earth into the depths of his kingdom. Imagine the ground opening, a rift in soil, a shadow reaching upwards and pulling her beneath. For the Greeks, this image didn't just symbolize capture. It was a crossing, the moment life itself slid into the domain of death. For Demeter, the loss was unbearable. The goddess who ensured crop and harvest suddenly withheld her gifts. Her sorrow mirrored what she controlled. Fields grew barren, seeds refused to sprout, fruits rotted before ripening. Demeter walked the earth searching for her daughter, but in her grief, she turned her face away from humanity. People starved, animals perished, even the gods felt the shock ripple, because without grain, offerings dwindled. The balance between humans and gods grew fragile. It's worth pausing here. This story tied survival on Earth to the bond of a mother and daughter. Demeter's love wasn't gentle background, it was force. Her feelings influenced the living world, teaching that the breaking of bonds has consequences that echo beyond families. If Persephone remained hidden in darkness, so too would all fields remain void of life. Eventually, the crisis reached a point where Zeus had to intervene. Crops could not remain dead forever. Humanity's prayers could not be fulfilled if no sacrifices survived. Reconciliation became essential, and so negotiations began over Persephone's fate. Could she remain above with her mother, or below as Hades' queen? Here's where a detail in myth creates tension. Persephone, while in the underworld, had eaten seeds of the pomegranate. In Greek tradition, eating food from a place tied you to it. Even a bite could bind you. Persephone's act, simple as it sounded, meant she could not return fully to her mother's side. She was part of the underworld now. To eat of it was to belong, no matter how unwilling her entry may have been. So a compromise formed. Persephone would not vanish forever, but she would not dwell always in the sunlight either. Part of each year, she would walk with Demeter, bringing bloom and growth. The fields would respond, and winter would loosen its hold. But for part of each cycle, she would descend again, queen beside Hades in the darkness. That time of absence would draw the cold. Crops would wither, trees grow bare, earth fall into apparent death until she rose again. And with that, the Greeks explained the seasons. Persephone's coming and going, her motion between above and below, framed the cycle of growth and decay. When she was with Demeter, flowers opened, meadows danced with life, and fruits swelled heavy on branches. When she stepped below, the warmth waned, the land mourned, and for months, decay marked the land. Spring was her return, winter, her absence. This cycle showed something profound. Life and death weren't opposites, tearing each other apart. They belonged to a rhythm. The underworld wasn't a void, separate from growth. It was a crucial part of it. In a sense, Persephone bridged both realms. She was daughter of the harvest goddess, yet queen of the dead. Death could not claim her wholly. Life could not contain her forever. She belonged to both, and both defined her. Think of it like breathing. Inhale, exhale. Each depends on the other. You cannot keep your breath only in or only out. Life cannot remain permanent spring. It cannot remain permanent winter. Persephone's journey explained season by season what humans already observed, that everything alive must pass, and yet, from what has passed, life returns. What makes the story still compelling is how it doesn't simplify the emotions. Demeter's grief wasn't erased. Hades' desire wasn't softened into romance alone. Persephone's fate wasn't clean choice. The myth allowed complexity. Love, sorrow, compromise, inevitability. It said the world wasn't divided in clear, soft lines. Instead, it balanced on negotiation, tension, and the acceptance of cycles. For Hades himself, Persephone's presence reshaped his reign. Until then, he ruled a silent kingdom with no equal beside him. With her arrival, the underworld became not only a place of endings, but a court with a queen who linked it back to fertility. Through Persephone, Hades' realm and Demeter's fields shed a bond. Death and life curved together, inseparable. For mortals, this myth explained why winter came at all, why crops did not grow endlessly, but it also reassured them. Just as Persephone returned, so too would warmth, fields and fruit. Death was not the collapse of everything. Absence did not last forever. Beneath the cycle, return was guaranteed. Notice how the balance also granted Persephone power. Though she began as a daughter taken, she ended as a queen governing alongside Hades. Myths at times describe her with judgment in the underworld, offering fates to souls. She was no longer only the one pulled downward. She became one who decided in her own right. In that way, the myth shifted her image from victim to bridge. one who held dual sovereignty as no other figure did. So when the Greeks looked at their fields and saw flowers open after frost, they saw not only nature reviving, but a queen returning. Persephone's face in blossom, Demeter's joy in the swelling crop, Hades content again in shadow. It all reflected human truth, that endings and beginnings are tied. Spring follows winter, because return follows absence. Growth appears not despite death, but with it. That's why the abduction myth was never only about a violent act of taking. It was about connection. It explained why nature paused and why it restarted, why grief bears weight and why joy surfaces again. Persephone lived both above and below, linking what seemed separate into a single cycle. And through that cycle, what looked at first like loss transformed into rhythm itself. Her story made visible what humans already understood in their bones, that every bloom comes from something buried, and every season of darkness still carries the seed of return. Did you know Hades was said to be harder to deceive than Zeus himself? For a figure who rarely left the underworld, his reputation among mortals carried a weight that even the ruler of the skies couldn't always match. Mortals and heroes often imagined they could bargain with the gods, slip through rules, or charm their way into getting what they wanted. But when they walked through the gates of Hades' domain, something shifted. Bargaining looked weaker, logic less convincing, and promises rather empty. His authority anchored itself in a truth most could not escape. Death itself doesn't break for persuasion. Take the story of Orpheus. He was no ordinary soul, but a mortal with music so moving it was said even stones softened to listen. His wife, Eurydice, died from a sudden bite of a serpent. For most mortals, that would mark the end. Loss was permanent, rest final. But Orpheus believed his gift could move even the god who ruled beneath. He made the long crossing, descending to the shadowy realm, carrying not swords or armour, but his lyre. His song, piercingly human, filled that kingdom. Not only shades listened, Persephone turned her face, spirits grew quiet, even Hades paused. Imagine that for a moment. Even the god of the dead, stern and unshakable, arrested by grief, turned into art. Orpheus begged for Eurydice's return. He asked for a reversal, a breaking of the natural law. For a heartbeat, it almost worked. Hades and Persephone allowed her to follow him up, back toward light. But here, the condition mattered. The simplest rule was given. She would walk behind him as they ascended, and he must not look back until both stood again under the sun. One condition, direct and unavoidable. Yet even with his gift, Orpheus faltered. Near the threshold of life, his doubt cracked him open. He turned. Eurydice vanished back into the shadows, beyond calling. This moment shows something vital. Hades was not tricked. He was not bent. He gave a chance under rule, and when the rule broke, so did hope. His domain stood firm, and in that you glimpse what the Greeks believed about death. It does not humour hesitation, and it does not answer to pleading alone. Now consider Theseus, another hero who tried to test what lay beneath. He and his companion Pirithous imagined themselves bold beyond limits. They thought they could claim Persephone as a bride for Pirithous, as though the queen of the dead were open to mortal ambition. They marched down alive, trespassing where few dared even in dreams. Their confidence stood until Hades offered them seats of welcome, stone chairs that seemed harmless at first. Once they sat, they could not rise. The land itself bound them. It was a punishment with no fire, no roar, no violence. They simply remained, bodies frozen, minds aware, held in place forever. For Theseus, eventually rescue came when another hero, Heracles, later ventured below. But Pirithous remained fixed, never freed. The story paints an image hard to forget, ambition collapsing into quiet imprisonment. No duel, no spectacle, just stillness. To sit in a chair and realize eternity has taken you already was a reminder. Human arrogance has no footing in the underworld. These stories carried tension because mortals rarely succeeded in the realm of Hades. His rules weren't loops to slip through. Even when he permitted exceptions, as with Orpheus, they lasted only as long as discipline matched the bargain. The instant cracks showed, death's permanence returned. For ordinary humans, that meant prayer and ritual could honour the dead, but they could not truly undo the gate once passed. If you think of it as an analogy, Hades functioned like gravity. You can leap, you can push against it for a time, but ultimately, you cannot talk gravity into changing. Orpheus tried to sing his way out of it. Theseus tried to seize against it, but the law pulled them back. Inflexibility wasn't cruelty, it was consistency. It made the cosmos coherent. Without that unyielding anchor, no one could trust the pattern of life and death at all. That's something striking about how Hades differs from the other gods. Zeus bent for desire, falling in love and making exceptions. Poseidon roared with waves, flooding in anger, showing moods like tides. Even Hera, queen of Olympus, lashed out with vengeance and softened with honour. Their actions swung with time and feeling. Hades, by contrast, took on a role of refusal. He rarely pursued affairs above, rarely thundered across the sky, rarely gave signs of whim. His refusal set a frame. Death does not sway. It is absolute, and within its absoluteness the cycle of life makes sense. That's why stories of mortals trying to outwit him became warnings. They pressured the human urge to believe rules bend for us. They showed in story form what people already saw in their lives. No amount of love, talent, or ambition overturned death. You can memorialize, you can recall, you can keep memory like flame, but you cannot break the gate itself. Once crossed, it holds. Still, it matters that Hades wasn't painted as wicked in these accounts. He wasn't punishing Orpheus from malice or binding Theseus for glee. In both, he acted as embodiment of order. One rule, one structure, never unfair, but never soft. The myths left space for sympathy, around Persephone, around Demeter, even around mortals themselves. But with Hades, sympathy didn't alter outcome. He reflects the certainty that part of the universe must hold firm, no matter what voices cry out. Seen this way, his domain adds balance to the entire mythic system. Zeus rules law and kingship, Poseidon governs the chaos of seas, but Hades anchors the inevitability each being faces. He cannot be tricked, bargained past, or seduced into reversal for long. Mortals crossing his gates weren't denied because he enjoyed denial, but because his role was to maintain what could not break. And if this feels unsettling, that's part of why the stories survived. Humans retold them to remind themselves that longing, even the deepest longing, meets a wall. Orpheus, looking back too soon, mirrored how people often acted in grief, unable to trust, unable to keep walking. Theseus, stuck in shadow, marked the arrogance of assuming eternal rules could be claimed. The myths turn these lessons into characters so vivid, you still picture them now. So when you hear Hades was harder to deceive than Zeus, it isn't simply a piece of mythic trivia. It explains the foundation of how the Greeks thought the cosmos worked. Sky could bend, ocean could rage. But below, there was law so steady that even heroes singing at their most desperate, or kings boasting at their boldest, found no purchase. That steadiness gave shape to death, not as unfair cruelty, but as structure itself. So why did the Greeks see Hades not as a villain, but as balance? Tonight, that's the thread we'll follow. Because if you look at how we think of him today, the picture is often far darker than what the ancient Greeks imagined. Films and stories paint him like a devil, fiery and cruel, the god you're supposed to hate. But when you turn back to the original myths, you find something very different. Hades wasn't evil. He wasn't rebelling against the other gods, and he wasn't plotting downfall after downfall. Instead, he was steady. He was the necessary order that makes life make sense. That contrast is striking. In modern culture, we often treat death itself as the villain and project that image back onto Hades. He becomes a symbol of terror or punishment. But the Greeks lived closer to their mortality. They saw crops failing, plagues moving, life ending abruptly. Because death was constant, they viewed it not as a monster, but as part of the natural rhythm. And Hades, the one who ruled that domain, wasn't cast as a tyrant. He was more like a stern official who ensured boundaries held, not generous like Demeter in harvest, not shining like Apollo in light, but fair and unchanging. So here's the thing. What looks like cruelty in our eyes once looked like balance in theirs. Hades kept the underworld ordered. Without his rule, souls would wander. Without limit, the living and the dead might blur. He didn't decide the hour of anyone's death, nor did he roam the earth snatching lives. That was never his role. His rule began only when a life had already ended. In that way, he is less an executioner and more the keeper of the gate, the architect of structure beyond life. That leads to an interesting detail. The Greeks, for all their honesty about life and death, often avoided saying Hades' name directly. They feared summoning his notice, but avoidance didn't mean hate. It meant respect. Instead of calling him Hades, many used softer titles. One of the most common was Pluton, meaning the wealthy one. Why wealthy? Because through his domain he held every soul that ever lived. And beyond that, riches themselves, metals, gems, resources, were imagined as coming from beneath the earth. Hades' realm provided not only end for life, but deep abundance hidden underground. Think about that for a moment. The same god who ruled silence and shadow also carried the name that linked him to wealth. It shows that the Greeks did not reduce him to a single idea. They understood he embodied opposites, loss and resource, sorrow and plenty. In calling him Pluton, they honoured the unseen gifts of the earth, tying what was hidden in underground veins of silver and gold to the same force that sheltered human souls. In the ancient way of thinking, both wealth and death came from beneath. Religious practice reflected this. Unlike Zeus or Athena, festivals to Hades were rarer, quieter, and more private. Sacrifices were often given directly into the ground, as if feeding him through the soil, not lifted high on smoky altars. Even this carried symbolism. Hades did not claim the sky. Offerings needed to sink, as he himself ruled beneath. Cattle, sheep, or other animals might be given, but always with that sense of gravity, not festivity. People respected him too much for casual feasting. Here, you can see how ritual mirrored belief, reverence without celebration, because Hades was not near, not sociable, but necessary. Now let's pause and notice the tension. Popular culture leans into fire and threat. The Greeks leaned into structure and fairness. They imagined him as a stern king, not a monster. He was one of three brothers, equal in authority, ruling his share without envy of theirs. This equality matters, because it shows that fairness sat at the core of their view. Zeus guided the skies, Poseidon mastered the seas, Hades ruled beneath. None greater, none lesser. Without one, the world itself would break balance. In fact, Greek texts rarely describe Hades as cruel or violent. If punishment happened in the underworld, more often Thanatos or the Furies acted as agents. Hades himself oversaw, like a ruler in the court, ensuring sentences held, but not inflicting them directly. To call him evil would miss the point. He represented inevitability, and inevitability is not cruelty. It's simply what must be. If this fascinates you, keep watching your own thoughts as we explore the comparison, because we can learn something by contrasting our cultural fears with their respect. Today we often picture life as something meant to be stretched endlessly, every day pushing against the idea of ending. But the Greeks saw time cycling. Seasons carried death inside them. Crops died, winters came, bodies weakened. Hades was the god who anchored that cycle. Without him, Persephone could not return each spring. Demeter's story would hold no rhythm, and the world would lack its breathing pattern of loss and renewal. An analogy helps here. Think of a clock. You might love the hands as they move, because they symbolize the present moment passing. But beneath the face, the gears turn. They are cold, metallic, silent, but they create the clock's accuracy. Hades is like the gears, hidden but essential. Without his quiet enforcement, the visible motions collapse into nonsense. Another subtle note lies in how prayer and language treated him. The Greeks often spoke carefully when naming him, using softened words as if to remind themselves that too much direct attention could upset the balance. Euphemism protected them. Respect protected him. In ritual, they poured offerings downward. They marked his presence without spectacle. This careful acknowledgement shows the seriousness they placed on his role. But here's the twist. By treating him so respectfully, they also ensured he was never demonized in their own time. That darker image came later, as different cultures shaped him into a symbol closer to the devil than the Greeks ever imagined. For them he was stern, yes, but he was constant. He was not temptation, not rebellion, not hatred. He was balance. So why is this important? Because myths aren't just old stories of gods who no longer matter. They're reflections of how people made sense of life itself. Seeing Hades as necessary shows that the Greeks embraced death not only as fear, but as foundation. They understood that without that limit, life had no shape. Without Hades keeping shadow in place, light could not mean what it does. When we revisit him as he was, not as a villain in disguise, but as the quiet sovereign of shadows, something changes in us too. We see death not as a breaking of natural law, but as part of it. We see Hades not as a punisher, but as a custodian who carries the weight no other god could hold. And through that lens, death becomes less an enemy, more a piece of structure, a boundary line that does not hate us, but simply reminds us we are alive. That's the mini payoff in seeing Hades clearly. He was never evil, he was balance. He was the quiet reminder of limits. And in those limits, the Greeks found order, a way to live their days under the sky and by the sea, knowing that when they finally crossed below, the same structure awaited them. Not chaos, not cruelty, but the steady hand of a rightful king. Hades' story shows that the ruler of death was never chaos, but a guardian of order. His realm was structured, his rule balanced, his presence necessary. The Greeks did not imagine him cruel, but steady, ensuring that every soul had its place, and every ending belonged to a larger cycle. To see Hades clearly is to see death not as terror, but as structure that life requires. Limits give shape to existence, and darkness balances light. Subscribe to explore more nights, more myths, and more mysteries waiting quietly in the shadows, ready to reshape how you see the world.